The final effect, Amos declares, is the abandonment of all decent seriousness. Something like the outline of a literary program can be made out from all these, roughly as follows. The writer must avoid obscurity. He should be amusing, not the same as comic. He must not show off or be pretentious, but neither should he write down to his audience or sink beneath his own intellectual level. He should be modest enough to try out his work on friends. Otherwise, nothing should come between the writer and his readers. No arts council, for instance, though Amos's concern about that came later. For if writers can be said to have any common purpose, it is above all to communicate with an audience. Throughout his own writing career, Amos always worked with an imaginary audience in his mind, constantly looking over his shoulder and asking them, "Does this make sense? Is it boring? Does it work?" These views were shaped entirely by thinking about literature, and had nothing to do with politics. But it is not difficult to see how, in time, they might infiltrate Amos's political views. If an untrammeled market is the best means by which to produce and distribute good poetry, why not other things too? 10. Politics. Following what became jokingly known among Robert Conquest's friends as his first law, Amos became recognizably reactionary about education before he was reactionary about anything else. According to Conquest's law, people start becoming right-wing or conservative about things they know most about. As a teacher, what Amos knew most about was education. At Swansea, he didn't like what he saw, and much of what he didn't like was summed up in the person and views of his college principal, Sir John, later Lord Fulton. He thought of Fulton as an Oxford Balliol Lindsay sociological Philistine man, and blamed him as one of the architects of university expansion, which in Amos's view, far from bringing improvement, very nearly ruined the whole university system. In 1960, Fulton made a speech in which he proposed that a new university needed a faculty of 350 to 400 professors and lecturers. The ratio of students to staff should be 8-to-1, ergo, the university must have 3,000 students. Soon everybody seemed to be saying the same, and Fulton went on to become the first vice-chancellor of one of the new crop of universities, Sussex. 4 years after making his speech, Fulton felt able to say that he had been wrong only about one thing. He had thought it would take 10 years to create a new university along the lines he prescribed. Now he thought it could be done in 6. These were just the sort of arguments that Amos detested, since they reduced everything to numbers and left out everything about what a university should actually be doing, or what it was really for. Of course you could create more and more institutions, which you could call universities, and let them churn out more and more young people with what you could call degrees. All you had to do was lower standards. Figures pulled out of the air, like those Fulton used to demonstrate the ideal size for a new university, could be massaged and manipulated to produce whatever result you wanted. Amos found evidence of how this kind of manipulation could work when he and his friend David Sims decided to boost their incomes by marking some 800 school exam papers in English for the joint Welsh board. They retreated to the home of Sims' mother in New Tredegar and settled down to a bout of 9-hour-a-day sessions. Reading through the 16-page papers was dispiriting enough, with their just-readable handwriting, spelling that was no worse than poor, sentences less than intolerably ugly or incoherent, not to mention their hackneyed opinions. The two did their best to be fair, and Amos supposed they did that as well as most examiners. But however conscientious, the most they could hope to do was rank candidates in order from best to worst. Standards were another matter. These were fixed by the examination board, which could do as it pleased. So if 70% of candidates passed one year and 75% the next, it did not mean the candidates had become cleverer. It simply reflected a decision of the board. Intelligence, competence stay the same, Amos wrote in his memoirs. All you can do is monkey with percentages, usually for political reasons. In the 1960s, Amos became notorious for what was commonly thought to be his personal slogan, "More means worse." What he actually wrote was "More will mean worse," for he did not pretend to formulate some immutable Newtonian law of the educational universe, let alone the universe at large. Nor was he reacting to the expansion of the university system, since he wrote the words in 1960 before the expansion had properly got going. He was making a prediction based on his own experience as a lecturer at Swansea and in America. "University graduates," he wrote, are like poems or bottles of hock, and unlike cars or tins of salmon, in that you cannot decide to have more good ones. All you can decide to have is more. Amos's phrase, "more will mean worse," was to haunt him all his life, getting twisted in this way and that as the years went by. By 1994, a review by John Banville in the New York Review of Books had claimed that Amos had formulated the neat, if simplistic dictum that in life, as in art, more means less, an utterance that Amos had never come near to making. But Amos's skepticism about the way universities achieved their results was already on show much earlier than 1960, in Lucky Jim, the typescript of which was finished by the spring of 1953. Jim Dixon shares digs with a lecturer from the English department, Alfred Beasley, who calls his professor Fred Carno, but has at least one good thing to say about him. Fred's about the only prof in the place who's resisting all this outside pressure to chuck firsts around like teaching diplomas and push every bugger who can write his name through the pass courses. Dixon says that in his history department, everyone gets through, because the person in charge of exams is a tender-hearted chap. Beasley continues, "Go to most places and try to get someone turfed out merely because he's too stupid to pass his exams. It'd be easier to sack a prof." Irritated as he is by the system, Beasley can see all too easily how pressure of one kind and another compel it to work the way it does. Most of the students are paid for by grants from education authorities, which don't like to be told their students have failed because that means their money has been wasted. Failure could be prevented by entrance exams to keep out the ones who can't read or write, but then the numbers of students would be halved, so staff numbers would have to be halved too. And then there was the demand for school teachers, for example. If 200 were required, 200 must be delivered, and that would be done even if it meant lowering the pass mark to 20%. These are arguments in the mouths of fictional lecturers gossiping about their college, and need not be taken as the literal truth about what Amos thought. But it was not so far from the truth either. Amos knew of a lecturer in the English department who had given pass marks to only 2 students on his first time out as an examiner. The prospect of such a poor set of results had caused so much upset that the marks were quietly readjusted to let most of the students pass through to the next year, for if they hadn't, what would the teaching staff have been left to do? The lecturer had moved on, but his legend lingered. When Amos went to arts faculty meetings, much of the arguments he heard revolved around standards and how they should be set, and there always seemed to be a voice to argue for the soft option that would at least let students proceed to the next stage, however dismal their performance so far. Nor did Amos need exam results to convince him of low standards. In his very first year at Swansea, he came across students he believed should not have been there because they were not capable of benefiting from that kind of education. They had not wanted to be there and did not know what to do when they got there. He also found a handful of good students that year and throughout his teaching career, their numbers never increasing, but their proportion in an expanding student body continuously dwindling. Amos's opinion of the dubious benefits of growth in higher education was confirmed by the year he spent in America in 1958-9. He taught at Princeton and lectured at a dozen other universities to supplement his stipend, regurgitating his thoughts on problems of a comic novelist at each one in return for a check for $300 or thereabouts. Being so much richer than Britain in the 1950s, America could afford to educate far more young people at universities, and did. But Amos found that while quality was high at Princeton or Harvard, it fell away drastically at lesser campuses, the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana being the worst example he came across. The Amos view of universities is undeniably lofty. He sees them as the guardians of the nation's culture. They should set the highest possible standards and be wholly autonomous, deciding for themselves what research and teaching to do. If, for instance, the philosophy department decided to take no undergraduates for 10 years while it rethought its program, then it should be allowed to do so, on the grounds that nobody could know better than the faculty. Science would be taught and studied, but only at the highest level, while practical skills should be banished to technical colleges and the like. By these standards, most of today's universities will inevitably seem third-rate. Right or wrong, however, Amos has been consistent over many years in his belief that the expansion of higher education has brought no increase in the numbers actually benefiting from it. In the 1990s, he would add one further piece of bad news to his reading of the educational scene. If he had to choose between 2 graduates with identical qualifications, one of whom had acquired a degree in 1973 and the other in 1993, he would automatically choose the first of the two. The older graduate would have read more than the younger, who could be assumed to have spent more time with television and records, and so would inevitably be the more ignorant of the two. Amis once addressed Kenneth Baker, former Education Secretary in Mrs. Thatcher's government, on the subject of higher education, while both were descending the steps of the Garrick Club. Amis had 3 points to make. The government had not tried to use higher education for purposes of social engineering. Good. Its expansion of vocational training was good too. But as for university education, he said, there your government has been at fault. Baker's response was not quite what Amis had been hoping for. He shouted, "Taxi," dived into a black cab and disappeared. Mrs. Thatcher's treatment of the universities was almost the only question of policy on which Amis dissented from her, and he thought Oxford University did exactly right by withholding from her the honorary degree normally given to any of its graduates who become Prime Minister. It was Amis's views on education that were the first to earn him a wide reputation for political unsoundness, i.e., for not being unambiguously left-wing on every issue. During his time in Swansea, however, Amis continued to drift from the left across all fronts. He still voted Labour, but with steadily diminishing enthusiasm. Beneath the angry young man tag, which seemed such a hallmark of solid left-wing authenticity in the 1950s, he was changing. Hope that there might, after all, be something worth salvaging in the Soviet variety of communism sputtered briefly after the death of Stalin in 1953. Amis remembers a broadcast, one of the most moving he ever heard, in which a Soviet spokesman admitted that mistakes had been made. But such hope as that roused was finally extinguished with the Soviet suppression of the Hungarian uprising in 1956. The uprising coincided with another disaster, the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Suez, over which Amis took to the streets, though never much given to marching and banner-waving. The demonstration was organized by students, among them Paul Wilkinson, later Professor of International Relations at the University of St Andrews, and Director of the Research Institute for the Study of Conflict and Terrorism at St Andrews and in London. Most of the college staff were too cautious or hostile to join in. Grateful for Amis's support, the students invited him to the head of their march, hoping, too, that his presence there might act as a deterrent to the engineering students who, famously right-wing, were expected to cause trouble. As things developed, it was not violence from those students Amis had to face, but violence from an old lady who abused him, tore the placard from his chest. It read demurely, "Eden, abide by UN decision," and chased him down a side street. Being faster on his feet, Amis escaped her wrath, and managed to rejoin the column unharmed. He thought Suez was not only wrong, but a dreadful error, because it made the West look as bad as the East. But it was the Soviet suppression of those supposed to be its allies that made the deepest impression. After 1956, he never shifted from a firm and total anti-communism. Amis made this perfectly clear in a letter to the communist newspaper The Daily Worker in February 1957, after the newspaper's Arnold Kettle had seemed to be trying to enlist him as a sympathizer at heart, if not a party member. "I have had Marxism, in both senses of the word," Amis wrote. "I have experienced the ailment and so am immune, and I have also utterly rejected it. No worldview, it seems to me, comes within light years of being adequate to the world it professes to categorize. Each fact, each entity, each event is unique. To pretend otherwise is mere Victorian system building. Marxism, I think, does just that. It repels me also by offering certainty instead of truth." After scorning Kettle's claim that communism is not violent, Amis concludes, "I used to be able to say that some of my best friends are communists. I can't anymore." The piece that provoked this letter was a notice by Kettle of a pamphlet Amis wrote for the Fabian Society, Socialism and the Intellectuals, 1957, in which he speculated why it was that intellectuals like himself were politically apathetic. He distinguished between romantic and unromantic approaches to politics and concluded that the romantic type sought out causes, while the unromantic were likely to be more pragmatic. A poet, say, would opt for Marxism, while a schoolmaster would stick with social democracy. But close reading of 1930s writers like Auden, Spender, and Day-Lewis had persuaded Amis that their politics went wide rather than deep. Their protest was personal as much as social. They were conducting in public a personal vendetta against their parents, and one or two unsympathetic headmasters. Indeed, Amos was inclined to think that all middle-class Britain, not just the intellectuals, were pulled one way or another in politics by temperament alone. The family, for example, could seem a warm environment, or something to be fled from and rebelled against. Here, surely, Amos had in mind his own phase of rebellion against his parents as much as Auden's or anybody else's. Romanticism in politics Amos defined as an irrational capacity to become inflamed by interests and causes that are not one's own, that are outside oneself. And he said he was this kind of romantic himself. The trouble was that there were few causes on offer to the cruising rebel, no Spain or fascism or unemployment left to rekindle the zeal of the 30s. Cyprus, then engaged in its campaign for independence, Amos thought was the only issue around comparable to Spain, but nobody could be bothered even to go to protest meetings about it. All that was left to attract the contemporary romantic were non-political issues, or ones that are not in the first place political. The colour bar, horror comics, juvenile delinquency, the abolition of capital punishment, the reform of the laws relating to divorce and homosexuality. These, he thought, should be on Labour's programme, though he could see the difficulty of rousing the support of dockers, for instance, behind the homosexual cause. Amos concluded that the apathy of the intellectuals was probably no bad thing, since the intellectual was as likely to be wrong as the next man, and probably more so. The reason for this was that the intellectual had no personal axe to grind. I think the best and most trustworthy political motive is self-interest. I share a widespread suspicion of the professional espouser of causes and do-gooder, the archetypal social worker who knows better than I do what is good for me. In his own secure job, he really had nothing to complain about, so the only reason he could have for getting politically active would be a sense of guilt. But this was not enough. How agreeable, he thinks, to have a respectable motive for being politically active. Amos was writing only 3 weeks after the twin Suez-Hungary debacles, but even these he thought unlikely to rouse the intelligentsia from its slumbers. At this stage, Amos still saw himself as firmly, if inactively, rooted in the left. In his 1957 Fabian pamphlet, he says that any right-wing sentiment in the mouth of an intellectual or anywhere else is likely to annoy me, and he predicts that unless something very unexpected happens, he will vote Labour for the rest of his days. In an interview with Life magazine a year later, he set out a political programme so extreme that it would have alarmed even Labour's own extremists at that time. I'd start by nationalising everything in sight. We could use a great hurting swinge of socialism, he said. I would also abolish the public schools, the aristocracy, and naturally the House of Lords. As for the royal family, it serves a purpose as a sentimental glue for the Commonwealth and probably has to be preserved. But just as a personal feeling of my own, I would like to get rid of them, Queen and all. This provoked an outburst of indignation from the Daily Telegraph's Peter Simple at everything Amos represented. Utter imbecility, sterility and vacuity, boundless ignorance and impertinence, a wasteland of cheap slogans and catcalls. Perhaps the newspaper would have taken a more charitable line if it had known that Amos's interview had once again taken the form of a chat in a pub, this time with a Life reporter, who had the embarrassing gift of total recall. Soberly identifying self-interest as the only respectable motive in politics was, however, hardly evidence of socialist dedication to match this sort of talk, and Amos had had the candour to acknowledge it in his pamphlet, if only inside a pair of brackets. The only edge the Tories have over the Socialists, from my point of view, is that they at least are not out to do anybody any good except themselves. Clearly, there was a contradiction here between ideas and feelings waiting to be resolved one way or the other. Amos's pamphlet nettled some of the others who had been tagged with the same angry label as himself. Later, in 1957, a collection of essays appeared in a book entitled Declaration. The contributors were Doris Lessing, Colin Wilson, John Osborne, John Wayne, Kenneth Tynan, Bill Hopkins, Lindsay Anderson, and Stuart Holroyd, as representative of a group of supposed angries as could be assembled, and each was invited to state his or her position towards society, in effect their political credos. Two took the opportunity to swipe at Amos's pamphlet. Doris Lessing denied his claim that self-interest was the only authentic political motive. Everywhere in the world, people with nothing to gain from being socialists, nothing to gain in the sense that Mr. Amos uses, have become, are becoming, and will become socialists. Amos, she concluded, was generalizing from an emotion which is current among a section of his generation now. It is a temporary mood of disillusion. Lindsay Anderson was even more dismissive. Amos reveals himself as a coward, too scared to take up any stand at all. Socialism as a positive ideal involving definable human values apparently means nothing to him. One can only wonder why he continues to vote left. Through a lingering, irrational, shamefaced humanism, I suppose. But Anderson did concede that Amos's human impulses are genuine, even if he cannot really bring himself to trust them. The voice most obviously missing from Declaration was Amos's own. The book's editor, Tom Mashler, invited him to contribute, but Amos declined. Writing to a somewhat surprised Mashler, "I hate all this pharisaical twittering about the state of our civilization, and I suspect anyone who wants to buttonhole me about my role in society. This book is likely to prove a valuable addition to the cult of the solemn young man. I predict a great success for it." Having said his piece in the pamphlet, Amos was not inclined to say it all over again. For one thing, he genuinely disliked theorizing, whether about politics or about art. And then there was, after all, that apathy, which to Amos was not only a political posture among the intelligentsia, but a personal one too. The only issue besides Suez on which he felt strongly enough to demonstrate again was hanging. He turned out to picket Gwilym Lloyd George, the Home Secretary, when he visited Swansea. But by the late 1950s, his apathy towards political activity was pretty much complete. It was only during his brief romantic fling with communism, in his first terms at Oxford, that Amos was ever enthusiastic enough to be counted an activist. When he turned up at a Labour Party meeting over Suez, it was 15 years since he had been to any meeting like it. He arrived so fired with indignation that he determined to join the party on the spot. Within 15 minutes, however, I had silently released myself from that vow. He had forgotten how boring such gatherings could be. Thereafter he reverted to his usual minimalist approach to political action, putting a poster in his window, casting his vote, lending his car at election time, demonstrating once in 10 years, and chatting about politics with friends. In the 1950s it was fashionable for writers to be committed to the left, and to stand up and be counted on its behalf. Amos did his bit to show where he stood in his Fabian pamphlet, and that was enough for him. The fame or notoriety, or both, which he gained from that, and from the counterblast to it he wrote a decade later for the Conservatives, Lucky Jim's Politics, were out of proportion to Amos's real interest in the political world. Throughout his life, he has been far more concerned with, and given far more of his time and attention to, literary than political matters. But public reputations are not made by issuing a pamphlet arguing that, say, Houseman and Graves were better poets than Eliot and Pound, as it is not difficult to imagine Amos doing. Reputations are made by having strong opinions on questions of the day and expressing them with pugnacity, and they become all the more controversial if, like Amos, you switch sides, and can be handily caricatured as angry lefty turned fascist beast. Amos has been both a convinced left-winger and a convinced right-winger, yet nothing about politics has mattered to him nearly as much as drink, women, or literature. Amos's early fictional characters closely reflect this balance of his own interests. Jim Dixon is certainly on the left, but Lucky Jim has to be read with care if the evidence of his politics is not to be missed. He gives an elementary one-sentence lecture on moderate socialism. If one man's got 10 buns and another's got 2, and a bun has to be given up by one of them, then surely you take it from the man with 10 buns. And a few paragraphs later he predicts that there won't be rich people around much longer. But that is about all he has to say on matters of politics. John Lewis, in Amos's second novel, That Uncertain Feeling, is more of a class warrior. His wife Jean calls him Karl Bloody Marx Lewis. He regards himself as a sworn enemy of the bourgeoisie, is glad that it doesn't take 3 generations to make a gentleman anymore, and thinks the new privileged classes have a lot more to be said for them compared with the old. Lewis launches a diatribe on the Tories' treatment of the National Health Service, but is interrupted in mid-sentence. Towards the end of the story he even finds himself becoming reconciled to the bourgeoisie on the ground that the members of it he has come across are amiable and light-hearted people, and there aren't so many of those around that he can afford to turn sour or sociological on them. Lewis wears his ideological prejudices as a man might wear a tie to the office, not because he feels particularly comfortable in it, but because it is expected of people like him, and anyway, he's got used to dressing like that. When an attractive woman comes into the library where he works and turns out to be the wife of a local big shot as well, Lewis has to remind himself that it is his political duty to seem unimpressed. Leftish politics in these novels are part of the background, the standard baggage that a young, poorly paid junior lecturer or librarian with origins as modest as his job might be expected to carry. It would have been wildly out of character for Dixon or Lewis to be militant Tories. In any case, politics do not take up much of their time or thought. What does is avoiding boredom, keeping jobs, propitiating the boss, paying bills, making the most of what pleasures are to be had, and, most important and difficult of all, getting on somehow with the women in their lives. These were Amos's priorities too. His short story Moral Fibre, published in 1958, is perhaps a better guide than the early novels to the way his mind was moving on political matters, though the observations in it are social rather than directly political. John Lewis is again the narrator, leading some to believe that the story is a stray chapter from That Uncertain Feeling, but it is quite separate. Based on the incident of the generous whore already mentioned, John and Jean Lewis merely being re-enlisted as pegs on which to hang her tale, which had so intrigued Amos. Mayor Webster, a social worker and friend of Jean Lewis, brings Betty, age 19, to work as a domestic help in the Lewis household. She has 2 children, neither of them by her newly acquired husband, Brent Arnulfson. Betty soon disappears from her job with the Lewises, though she shows up again a couple of months later when Jean is out. She offers herself to John, mentioning that she has got in with the business girls, by which she most definitely does not mean secretaries or typists. The story ends with Betty in jail, having been caught helping to burgle a cafe, and John regretting that he cannot be at the gate with a bunch of flowers on the day she is released. For John Lewis's sympathies are all on Betty's side and against the social working Mayor Webster. Seeing Betty again, he reflects that being a prostitute was something you could be done a power of good by. Seeing Mayor prompts the contrary reflection. I put to myself the question whether the removal of all social workers, preferably by execution squad, wouldn't do everyone a power of good. Mayor thinks of herself and her colleagues as technicians in paternalism, while Lewis, watching her in action, thinks of her as more like a veteran colonial administrator, keeping the natives in order and patronizing them too. Lewis recognizes that people like Betty are a problem, but he can't see people like Mayor as the solution. He concedes to himself that at least Mayor, unlike him, is trying, but when he thinks harder about what she's trying to achieve, the picture changed a bit. Just as things like the Labour Party looked better from some way away than close to, so did social work. That makes him think about all the other people you had to have besides such people as Mayor: prison warders, local government officials, policemen, military policemen, nurses, parsons, scientists, mental hospital attendants, politicians, and, for the time being anyway, God forgive us all, hangmen. You had to have such people, but that didn't mean you should feel friendly towards any of them, bar the odd nurse. The story ends with this question unresolved. It was unresolved in Amos's mind too. Moral Fibre shows his mind moving against the constraints and restrictions of the welfare state and its meddling bureaucracies. But he had not yet made the connection to politics and shifted his support to the free market and the Tories. His ideas had not caught up with his feelings. 11. Portugal. Fame brought Amos invitations to travel, not always welcome. In his Swansea years he accepted 2. One took him on an enforced holiday to Portugal, the other to teach at Princeton. He was tempted to stay on in America, though not in Portugal. A few years later, Amos was also tempted to settle in Majorca and live the writer's life near Robert Graves, whom he much admired. But he resisted both temptations, settled for staying at home in Britain, and never seriously regretted it. Amos had grave doubts about abroad from the start, as did Garnet Bowen, the hero of his 3rd novel I Like It Here, 1958, which was closely based on Amos's Portuguese trip. Bowen, a literary journalist, is more or less forced into going to Portugal by an irresistibly large commission for a travel article from an American magazine, made even more worthwhile by a second commission from a British publisher. In Amos's case, compulsion took the form of a literary prize, which the winner could accept only on condition that he spent his prize money abroad. Yet the mere idea of leaving Britain makes both uneasy. Bowen recognises that he suffers acute prejudice about abroad, and goes over in his mind some of the things he doesn't like about travelling: disinclination for change, dislike of fixing up complicated arrangements, and fear of making a fool of himself. What Bowen gloomily thinks of as his deportation order arrives in the post one clear morning early in April. Amos's came in a telegram from his publisher in late March 1955. "Bravo! Jim has won Somerset Maugham Award. All our delighted congratulations, Hilary." As recognition for his first novel, this news was naturally welcome. The money, too. The snag came in the condition described by Hilary Rubinstein in a letter he sent on the heels of his telegram. "The Society of Authors man is writing to you today to remind you of the terms of the award, namely that you agree to spend the sum, £400, on not less than 3 months' travel or residence abroad." Abroad was bad enough, but being more or less forced into exile made it worse. Bowen protests to a publisher friend, Benny Hyman, who lightly resembles Rubinstein. "It's like being deprived of your citizenship." When Hyman says he wishes he could get away abroad for a bit, Bowen replies, "But I don't. I like it here, you see." Amos's own reaction was similarly downbeat. A few days after he heard about the award, he wrote to Larkin to complain. And now this deportation order from the Somerset Maugham Trust. Forced to go abroad. Bloody forced, man. If it wasn't that Hilly would enjoy it, and that it would look too eccentric to turn the award down, he would have been tempted to do exactly that. In May, he wrote to Robert Conquest with news of his plans. "We think we're going to Portugal after all now. What a fucking mess it all is. See England first, I say." The day before he departed from Southampton, on the 23rd of June, he wrote in the same mood to Anthony Powell, "Making the arrangements has been very protracted and horrible. Well, see England first is what I always say. When I write my travel book, Book 1, pages 1 to 185 will be called Getting Fixed Up," Amos told Larkin. "You really have no idea what the bloody business entails, or perhaps you can imagine." There were passports to be organised, tickets, money, typhoid injections, but he grudgingly conceded it should be all right. Paying guests with an English business type, about a dozen miles from Lisbon and near the sea. The 3 months enforced exile, prescribed by the award, could just about be fitted into Amos's summer vacation from the university. The bigger problem was deciding where to go. Not knowing much about abroad except what he had learned as a soldier, and on one post-war trip to France with Hilly and his Oxford friend Christopher Toswell, Amos consulted John Aaron Thomas, a wealthy Swansea industrialist, owner of the Newport Argus and married to Margaret, Amos's social working friend. John Aaron Thomas put him on to a Portuguese family he knew, the Pinto Bastos, who promised to see that the Amoses were looked after. What this turned out to mean was that a Pinto Basto employee called Barley rented the Amoses part of his home near Estoril. Barley, who by no very great leap of Amos's imagination becomes Oates in I Like It Here, had an English father, but had grown up in Portugal and married a Portuguese woman. Soon after he arrived in Portugal, Amos described him to Larkin. "Billy Barley, alias Joe, has turned out to be very amiable in a childish way. He's pure English by birth, Portuguese by nationality, bilingual, and feels himself of no certain country. I mean, he doesn't quite know which country he belongs to." Barley drank coffee from a coronation mug, had a picture of the Queen on the wall, and a tea caddy embellished with the Duke of Edinburgh's face. He was also a motorbike maniac, and Amos imagined a scene in the Portuguese story he intended to write whose hero, Lucky Jim Dixon, once more would ride on the back of a motorbike after dark, in a high wind, part of the way in very fast traffic through Estoril, with a Portuguese in front, practicing his English, turning his head to say, "Would you like to take a cup of coffee later? Do you like Portuguese coffee, or is it too strong?" Garnet Bowen was offered such a ride, but managed to avoid it. The Barleys seemed pleasant enough to begin with. The food, which they all ate together, might look a bit different from the English dishes on which they were modelled, but turned out not to be so different after all. And where different, not noticeably inferior or emetic, Amos reported to Larkin. Barley seemed generous with alcohol, too. While claiming that he hardly touched the stuff, he poured out large drinks before, during, and after meals for Amos himself. All on the house, too, Amos noted with satisfaction. There were problems as well, though. One was the size of the house. As described by Bowen, the minuteness of the Oates' establishment was its most striking feature. Its ground and only floor was about the size of half a badminton court, and into it were crammed a lot of rooms. A dining room, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a hall which doubled as maid's bedroom, and a bathroom come lavatory. The Amos family, like the Bowens, comprised 2 boys and a girl. In both families, mother and father shared 1 bedroom with their daughter, and the boys shared another, while their host's bedroom was converted during the day into what had been promised as their private sitting room. The lack of space might have been tolerable if only the household had been efficiently run, or, as Amos complained to Larkin, if the place had been clean, or if the lavatory hadn't smelled, or if there hadn't been so many flies everywhere, or if, above all, the meals had been ready on time, and had proved to consist, when ready, of food that Sally could eat. Sally took to yelling for an hour before meals at the prospect of food which she didn't like, or which made her ill, and nothing Hilly could say would persuade Mrs. Barley, an amiable half-wit, to change the menu. Amos's tolerance frayed. Soon after he arrived, he was able to tell Conquest, "Yes, Portugal is where I am. Quite all right, considering it's abroad, as I always say. Wonderful hot days. Food a bit oily, but very palatable. Drink abundant. Women so fine that I've cultivated an efficient protective armor of nursing the baby, playing with the boys, etc., and now hardly notice all the fine skins, imposing gaits, enormous busts, etc. I bathe a lot, do crosswords, read Bloomfield's language, and so on." 10 days later he sent Conquest what he called a short verse on Portuguese culture, to be sung to the tune of "She was poor, but she was honest," which he later put into the mouth of Garnet Bowen in slightly amended form. "See him gulping vino verde, scoffing filthy sheep's milk cheese, puffing fags of scent and mule shit, while he searches for his fleas. But he tells them obrigado, matches all their courtly grace, 'cause he's got his homeward ticket locked up safely in his case." And he added, "Feeling slightly sick, have just lit a tip-top, tobacco aromatico, 3 escudo, $30 for 20. Not like players, they aren't. Still, more's the price." But by the end of the month, Amos had had enough. "We've had a sort of muffled row with the chap who's putting us up here," he wrote to Conquest on the 31st of July. "He keeps getting more and more money out of us and giving us less and less in return, so we shall be getting out as soon as possible, in a week's time, I hope, and going south to the Prince Henry country," by which Amos meant to the Algarve. The muffled row over money arose when Amos worked out that he could live both more cheaply and better in a pensão, or boarding house. He discovered this when he ran into a Swansea couple, the Browns, and visited them at the Pensão Continental in Estoril, where they were staying. It would cost £2 10 a day for the 5 Amoses to live there, against the sum of about £3 7 he was paying the Barleys. There would be slightly better food. There was a lounge with easy chairs, and the bathroom smells only of soap, Amos reported to Larkin. The Browns put Amos in the way of an even better deal when they introduced him to an Ulster couple, the Tyrrells, who had a mountain chalet in Monchique, in the Algarve. They offered to let the Amoses have the chalet free once a sister of Tyrrell's had moved out. Until then, the Amoses could live in a pensão nearby. Amos by now was anxious to move with all possible speed, so offered a fortnight's rent as compensation for shortening his stay with the Barleys. Billy Barley studied his accounts and declared that he would make a loss unless Amos paid him for a full month. So Amos did, in order to keep the peace, until he could make final arrangements to move. Not content with this, Barley managed to chisel an extra £2 15 out of Amos by getting him confused over the rate of exchange between the pound and the escudo. It turned out that Barley had borrowed money from his firm in order to put in hand improvements that would make his house fit for the Amoses to live in, including a hot water geyser and a garage, and their defection meant he would not be able to pay his boss back. Amos finished up promising to send Barley yet another £40 when he got back to England. "Oh, the mean little bird-faced, ignorant, naturalized greaseball," he expostulated to Larkin. The Tyrrells, Amos told Larkin, are well worthy of fictional transcription, and they duly made their appearance in I Like It Here as the Banyans, Harry, an Ulsterman, like Tyrrell, retired from an Indian bank, and his wife, Isabella, a Goanese, as was Tyrrell's wife. Tyrrell was notably, even embarrassingly, eccentric, given to periodical floor shows at the Pensau Continental, in which he would address an audience of French women in schoolboy patois. La plume de ma tante est dans la poche du jardinier. Or at an Estoril café recite the charge of the Light Brigade in 4 different voices, both of which performances Harry Banyan was to repeat in fictional form. The Banyans extricated the Bowens from Oates's establishment and installed them rent-free in a chalet they owned in the mountains that overlooked the coastal plain, as Monchique overlooks the Algarve coast. The Banyans have an adopted son, a young priest, whom Bowen calls afiliado, which is the Portuguese for affiliated or adopted. The Tyrrells, too, had an adopted son, whom they also called afiliado. He, too, was a priest, and eventually rose through the hierarchy to the dizzy heights of the bishopric of Oporto. The Amises had a tremendous drive down from Estoril, with an above-par dose of doubt, horror, and despair at the Tagus ferry, Amos informed Larkin. The embarkation point had been changed. The officials did not speak English, and did not anyway all know about the change. There was confusion over where to pay and how much, and Amos was down to his last pound. They stayed for 3 days at the Pensau Sol in the Pria de Rocha. Modest, quiet, clean, cheap, excellent food, polite staff, English-speaking proprietor, the lot, Amos wrote to Conquest. Then the family moved inland and uphill to Monchique. Amos told Conquest, "A lot of the Algarve is ruddy desert, as you say. The part where we are, about 15 miles from Portimao, equidistant from La Gauche and Silviche, is up a mountain, getting on for 2,000 feet, I believe, but sodding hot, and greener than the remoter neighborhood. While here I hope to draw as few sober breaths as possible, wine being 7 shillings a gallon, and not at all bad either, and there being 3 bottles of a kind of local applejack made from a kind of arboreal strawberry, Medronia, available by the courtesy of this C.H. Tyrrell character, and absolutely free. There's not much to do here except drink, eat, sleep, and beat down the stares of the natives, but I reckon I can get by on that for another 4 weeks." Amos described a typical day in Monchique to Larkin. He had breakfast, then pumped the pump which supplied their water. After that he wrote letters or worked on his novel. At noon he smoked and drank a couple of glasses of wine, ate a salad lunch, and drank some Medronia. In the afternoon he would rest or go to the beach at Pria, where a girl of about 14, with a very deep-pitched laugh and the darkest fair hair I've ever seen, seemed to have taken a fancy to him. I think she knows what I'm thinking. So does Hilly. In the evening Amos lit pressure lamps, ate dinner, and drank a good deal before retiring to our hard but flealess couches. He described Pria at some length, for the benefit of Conquest's mother, who was considering a holiday in the area. The beach is most impressive. The landscape otherwise is pretty arid now, but very attractive, I hear, in the autumn and winter. It's pretty quiet all round. No nightlife to speak of, though there are cafes. A small resident English population in Portimao and thereabouts. Hilly wants me to add, 1, that she personally would go mad from boredom if left here on her own, and 2, that the town is an ugly little town. It is. They catch sardines, and then they tin sardines, and then they transport sardines. By the beginning of September, the tedium predicted by Hilly as likely to consume someone on their own was beginning to take Amos over in spite of his not being alone. "Ennui lies upon me like a hangover," he told Conquest. Or perhaps the other way round. It's the getting pissed every night, so as to get to sleep on the hard bed which gets me down, if you get what I'm getting at. Bloody terrible, man. No more wine for me after I come back. I shall stick to splendid, virile Nordic gin and healthy, bracing tonic. There's something subtly vinous about the Lisbon gin I must have mentioned to you. I can't remember when I last voided a firm motion, if you'll pardon the expression. On the same day, the 7th of September, he wrote in more sombre mood to Victor Gollancz. "The most important fact about Portugal, as of now, is, from my point of view, that I shall be leaving it soon and coming home. I thought I knew all the main categories of boredom one was ever likely to encounter, but I made the mistake of thinking it was only people who could be boring. Places can be as efficient in this way, if not more so. I'm getting through the last few weeks by drinking a lot of local gin, 11 shillings a bottle, and a kind of applejack cum Pernod that they go in for a lot hereabouts, and no wonder. Also by having the DDT spray within reach. The day of the 7th of September seems to have been an occasion on which Amos felt particularly low about the Portuguese version of abroad, and particularly keen to complain about it, for he also sent a postcard that day to Anthony Powell, showing a massive, phallic-looking rock formation on the seashore. "This is pretty impressive, no?" he wrote. "And when you get tired of looking at it, you can always turn round and look at a hill. And when you get tired of that, there's plenty of sport to be had going round the house with the DDT spray. And then you get your homeward vouchers out and read them attentively. Still, I've got nice and brown, and that's something." But things were not all going badly. Amos's second novel, That Uncertain Feeling, was published while he was in Portugal, and he had been anticipating its reception with some anxiety. "As regards That Uncertain Feeling," he wrote to Conquest towards the end of August, "no doubt the blasts of critical hate are already beginning to poop off." But he added, "Your mention of John Davenport's approval cheered me a lot. I can't think why." The reason for Amos's doubt about Davenport's approval was a recent letter in the Spectator. See shortly. A few days later, Hilary Rubinstein sent him copies of the book's early reviews, and good news about sales. "I'm so immensely relieved that my neurotic forebodings about the book have proved to be unjustified," Amos responded on the 2nd of September. "I really think the reviewers have been most generous, and the fact that about 4 of them have stigmatized the book as passing as vulgar has been almost as encouraging as their praise. I was afraid some of them might have praised it for being sensitive. It seems I needn't have worried." In his letter to Gollancz 5 days afterwards, Amos repeated his gratitude for the way the book seemed to be going, and his sense of relief. "I'm mightily pleased that Uncertain Feeling seems to be selling satisfactorily. I really was beginning to have kittens about it. In fact, had been having mild ones for some time, and this was probably why the manuscript turned up on your desk some time after deadline. Every time I went through it, there seemed to be more wrong with it. Apparently I needn't have worried overmuch. A vast relief." Amos's gratitude that 4 of his reviewers should have found his new novel vulgar rather than sensitive may seem a bit odd. Surely a literary gent, even a straightforward literary chap, would find the second adjective preferable to the first when used about his own work. But even before he left for Portugal, Amos was in a sensitive mood about sensitive writers, especially writers who dedicated their sensitivity to that equivocal place abroad. In May 1955, Amos had shown what he thought about them when he pitched into the whole travel writing genre in a Spectator review. Under the title, Is the Travel Book Dead?, he excoriated Laurie Lee's new book about Spain, A Rose for Winter, along with another book by Peter Main about the Pathan tribes of the Pakistan-Afghan border, The Narrow Smile. What Amos objected to in travel writing were 2 things he found in equal measure in both these books: their escapism and their style. It might be that writers of books like these could justify their travels with such lofty-sounding motives as to get away from the exhausted sterilities of Western civilization, though Amos was inclined to doubt it. All the more so when he found that what this usually boiled down to was nothing very different from the feeling that the other fellow's grass is greener, that the really good time or good life is going on somewhere else. As for style, travel books leaned towards the more elaborate and unfashionable graces of prose, but these degenerate briskly into an empty and indecent poeticism, apparently based on a desire to get into the next edition of the Oxford Book of English Prose. Amos judged Laurie Lee guilty on both counts. On the stylistic chart, he concluded, one way of summing up this book would be to call it a string of failed poems. Failed, not very good poems, too. But Amos found Lee even more at fault with the content of his book, with the way in which he portrayed the Spaniards he wrote about, so far as this can be debarnacled from rhetoric, generalization, and rhapsody. According to Amos, where Lee seeks to show us gaiety, mere instability or hooliganism emerges. Unself-consciousness is detectable as coxcombry or self-pity, while the gift attributed to Andalusians of greeting others' misfortune with a shrug or a grin is neither mature nor admirable. Garnet Bowen takes up the same theme of double standards. According to him, people when abroad behave as if they had invented the country instead of just living in it. So they feel entitled to see things in ways they would never see them at home. The staring, which he found the Portuguese went in for a lot, was an example. If it happened in England, he surmised, it would be described as the mindless inquisitiveness of those whose greyly uniform lives were nourished on mere sensation. But in the sunny South, it would be a frank, free, healthy, open, uninhibited curiosity. In his review, Amis turned with relief from Mr. Lee's vulgar and sensational little book to Mr. Maine's. Laurie Lee was not pleased about any of this, as was still evident nearly 40 years later, on the rare occasions when both he and Amis showed up in the Garrick Club bar at the same time. Lee would take care to ensure that Amis saw him, so that Amis would know that Lee was giving him the cold shoulder by appearing not to notice him in return. Amis was kinder in his review to Peter Maine, finding him agreeably unliterary, and not the kind of writer who feels obliged to demonstrate his sensitivity at every turn. But Maine was still guilty of the escapist charge, of trying to demonstrate that Europeans could find some kind of answer to their spiritual problems in the lives of Patan tribesmen. I, for one, cannot share Mr. Maine's thesis that violence tends to become morally neutral when pursued openly in picturesque tribal costume, under conditions of physical discomfort and against a background of boulders and precipices. The Patan avenger, with his rifle and knife, is as contemptible, however much more impressive-looking, as our own species of gangster with his razor or bicycle chain. Whatever the separate defects of these two books in their style and their dubious morality, they seemed to Amis to share one further defect between them, a defect inherent in their form, the travelogue. This form depends on who the writer meets, or what happens to happen to him on his journey. As a result, the encounters Maine describes are for the most part indecisive, and the factual thread on which he strings them is inadequate to bear their weight. There is no principle of selection or emphasis. Amis proposed an alternative. Writers like Lee and Maine should choose another literary form in which to work out the kind of issues that interested them. They should write novels, and he mentioned E.M. Forster's A Passage to India as a possible model. In the next week's Spectator, John Davenport, the critic who was soon to give Amis's That Uncertain Feeling his approval, wrote a letter in defence of Lee and the travel book. Spain is hard and unsentimental. Mr. Lee does not sentimentalize it. He respects the rock-like integrity individual Spaniards have retained. Davenport was also unconvinced by the idea that the travel book should be replaced by the novel. Forster's The Hill of Davy might not be a travel book exactly, but it wasn't a novel either. Yet it was surely more successful than A Passage to India as a revelation of Indian character. And there was A.J. Ackley's Hindu Holiday. Could a novelist improve on that? Davenport concluded with a chirpy invitation to Amis. Is it an impertinence to hope that the talented winner of the Somerset Maugham Award may gain some tolerance from his coming experience of foreign parts? Who knows? Perhaps he will bring back a travel book with him. Which was exactly what Amis had started to think of doing even before he left Swansea. The following week, Conquest came to his defence in The Spectator, admitting that Amis's proposal that travel books should become novels was rather eccentric, but insisting that it was at least provocative and worth arguing about, and insisting even more strongly that whatever might be thought about travel books as novels, it would be a pity if that controversy distracted attention from the more important task of giving hell to poetic prose. Amis got a letter of his own in the week after that. Only the slowness of the posts between Portugal and home prevented him stepping in quicker, in which he defended his review and assured Davenport that I'm not being grumpy about foreign parts, only about people being silly about them, and that the foreign part I'm in now seems good-o so far. Amis continued the argument privately in his correspondence with Conquest. What I think I feel about the business, he wrote to Conquest on the day his Spectator letter appeared, is first, I'm all in favour of escapism, but people should realise that that is their motive, very often, for buzzing off down south, and not try to inflate their pleasure, etc. Trips into a spiritual pilgrimage, and then come and tell me about it in a travel book. And second, the weather is fine, and the girls may well fuck more, no personal experience, and that's all very fine, and chaps are sensible to go after it. But again, you get this frightful mystique-mongering which obscures the quite definite and very concrete advantages of going abroad, not to mention the equally definite snags. Are you with me, mate? In his next letter to Conquest, 10 days later, Amis returned to the subject. I'm sure we agree about this abroad thing, as you say, and my only point this time is about the Patans. I don't want to stop them being like they are, but I wish old Maine would see, or say, that murder is murder, wherever and however you do it. He can still admire them, by all means, after seeing and saying this, but I don't think he should gloss over it. Too many of these chaps think that if something happens abroad, it's somehow all right, even if it's the kind of thing which over in the old country would send them and me running for a cop. Lee's book is notable as much for bloody stupid ideas as for crappy style, and these ideas are shared by other craps, Davenport and his rock-like integrity, etc. I really do mind the ideas more than the style, bloodiest as the latter undeniably is. In the same letter, Ames aired a mild worry to Conquest. He had attacked Laurie Lee in one Spectator piece, and Evelyn Waugh's new novel Officers and Gentlemen in another, and now he was about to attack the posthumous collection of Dylan Thomas's prose pieces, A Prospect of the Sea, in a third. Feel slightly nervous about this, he wrote. The only honest way of doing it is to attack it, but after the Lee business, and being rather less than cordial to old Evelyn, it will seem as if I've gone all sour. Still, someone ought to give Dylan a bouquet of old bogwort before long. By the time he next wrote to Conquest, 13 days later, the Lee book was still on his mind, though now mixed up with the equally poetic prose of Thomas. To finish off this Lee business, I think the two classes, A, chaps who think abroad is mythically fine, B, chaps who think LL and DT, Laurie Lee and Dylan Thomas, are true poets, overlap quite a lot in practice. Hard, perhaps, to distinguish, but after much consideration I will admit that it is a worse failure to taste, etc., to esteem LL and DT than to be one of A. But literature not being very important, I still think A worse, because it makes people behave stupidly, and that means that some other people are going to get hurt, which is undesirable. Liking DT is bloody silly, but it doesn't do anyone much harm. I hate it all right, though. My review has gone off to the Spectator. Don't know whether you'll agree with it. All this literary talk was mixed up with chat about Portugal and other matters in Amos's letters to Conquest. But even this much theorizing was unusual for him, and he evidently felt some awkwardness about it. Afraid all this sounds a bit pompous, he wrote down the margin of one letter, and in another he made a joke of the whole thing. It's nice to think that our exchange of views on the lorry question will almost certainly appear, say about 1990, you know, a book of about 50 pages costing 8 and 6, Spanish Fly, a literary exchange, the Amos Conquest Correspondence, edited by John Wayne, O.M., published by Hartley and Tomlinson. Amos seemed to shy away from these arguments, as if, by taking such literary questions too seriously, he might himself fall into the trap of pretentiousness, might even become the sort of self-conscious literary person who poeticizes his prose, mistakes colourful foreigners for heroic souls, and thinks abroad is mystically fine. But his articles and letters of that summer touched on issues he cared about very much, even if he was reluctant to theorize out loud about them. Too much theory always being, in his view, the enemy of practice, apt always to clog the writer's mind with inhibiting second thoughts. By reading travel books, and by going abroad himself, he had uncovered a whole new field where the aesthetic and social snobbery he so detested could mingle and thrive, just as they did at Professor Welch's cultural soirees. The bogusness of the travel mystique was different, but no less real or offensive than the bogusness of the professor's notions of culture, or Gareth Probert's notions of true Welshness. Travel writers like Lee and Maine were at fault because they deceived their readers into confusing mere enjoyable escapism with profound spiritual pilgrimage, or into believing that gangsters were somehow all right if they dressed up in picturesque tribal costumes and carried knives instead of razors. See yonder peasant colourfully dressed, by sterile northern cultures unimpressed, show his robustly independent heart, and kick the donkey in its tenderest part. In these words Amos mocked the distorted vision and double standards of the writer dazzled by abroad, in a verse pastiche he never published. But how exactly did you get the balance right? Give foreign parts their due without getting absurdly reverential about them, and knocking the old country at the expense of all things foreign? One way to find out might be for Amos to write a travel book himself. A new kind of travel book, if such could be devised, which would avoid the double pitfalls of overdoing the enchantments of abroad and overblowing the prose. He had already been turning over the possibility of doing something of this sort before he left home. A few days before Amos sailed for Portugal, Philip Larkin wrote to a friend, "Kingsley sets out for Portugal this week on the more money for 3 months. A travel book may result, like a space thriller by John Hewitt, a poet, a verse play by Mickey Spillane, a writer of tough guy thrillers, or a good poem by A. Alvarez, another poet of whom Larkin did not think much." Larkin, in other words, did not expect Amos to come up with anything startling or innovatory in the travel book line, and Larkin was right. The book Amos started to write, from his experience of Portugal, was intended to be part fact, part fiction, with Jim Dixon returning to make a second appearance as its hero. Lucky Jim ended with Dixon taking a leap into an uncertain future when the wealthy Scotsman, Gore Urquhart, offers him a job as his secretary. In the new book, Gore Urquhart was to send him on a mission to Portugal, where he would encounter the real Kingsley Amos. At least, this was one possible strategy. But Amos could not make the book work in this hybrid part fact, part fiction form. Instead, he reshuffled his ideas into a more conventional novel, abandoning Jim Dixon and replacing him with Garnet Bowen, and leaving out Kingsley Amos altogether. If this was the failure Larkin predicted, it can also be seen as Amos taking heed of his own advice to chroniclers of abroad like Laurie Lee: write a novel, not a travelogue. While in Portugal, Bowen expends no effort on researching his travel article, though he thinks a lot about abroad in general, and how writers cope with it in particular. Most of his energies are devoted to coping with his family and with Portugal, as well as making a not very wholehearted attempt to get on with a play he is supposed to be writing. He tears it up on the boat home. The rest of his time he devotes to the second of his 2 commissions, the one given him by his publisher friend Benny Hyman. This is to seek out Wulfstan Strether, a famous English writer who has lived for many years in Portugal. Strether was thought to have given up writing for good, but a new novel has mysteriously arrived at Hyman's office, where, on evidence of the manuscript alone, opinion is divided over whether it is authentic Strether or fake. To make things more difficult, all personal contact has been lost between Strether himself and his publisher. Hyman asks Bowen to check out the man claiming to be Strether. "Just the thing for you, this, isn't it?" Hyman says. "You and your sham detecting, Lark. A sort of test, in a way." Sham detecting was very much Amos's thing, too. The names he gave his exiled writer might have been, and probably were, designed to mark him down as a suspicious character from the start. The sort of names that would set anyone's sham detecting antennae quivering. Wulfstan, Archbishop of York, died 1023, author of vernacular homilies, and considered by Amos to be the most boring of all English writers, even of that gang of boar champions, writers in Old English, and Strether, Lewis Lambert, one of the ambassadors in Henry James's novel of that name. And the early evidence, consisting mostly of Bowen's observations of the way the man calling himself Wulfstan Strether carries on, suggests that he is indeed the fake his name alone makes you suspect him of being. After listening to him pronounce at some length about literary criticism, Bowen thinks, could a man who had really written all those novels really be bounded by James and Conrad and Edith Wharton and Meredith? Could he really not have noticed anything that had happened since? And wasn't his whole attitude that of a reader rather than a writer? Wasn't his whole persona arranged on a line of what a reader would expect a writer to be like? Bowen becomes even more suspicious when he and the dubious Strether visit the tomb of Henry Fielding in Lisbon. Fielding is one of those rare writers Bowen admits to thinking of very highly, the only non-contemporary novelist who could be read with unaffected and wholehearted interest, the only one who never had to be apologized for or excused on the grounds of changing taste. He is therefore flabbergasted when the man claiming to be Strether pronounces himself to be a cut above Fielding on the grounds that Fielding is merely a comic writer while he, Strether, writes tragedy. In the field of the novel, he sonorously declares, Fielding is indeed the colossus of the 18th century, but I cannot feel that posterity will care to place him beside the colossus of the 20th, i.e. himself. Eventually Bowen is convinced that Strether is who he says he is, though proof comes in evidence of a non-literary kind, including an old photograph. Once his identity is established, Strether's behaviour falls into place. He could not be a phony, because he would not have said he was better than Fielding if he was. He would have played safe by being humble and reverential at the Fielding tomb. The fact that he didn't meant he couldn't have been putting on an act. And the reason that he behaved like a posturing, prancing phony was because it came naturally. Strether, being old enough to belong to what Bowen calls the Great Writer period, which he defines as being roughly between Roderick Hudson and about 1930, Death of Lawrence and the next bunch all just starting off, Greene, War, Isherwood, Powell, or perhaps 1939. Being born when he was, Strether simply couldn't help being the sort of person he was. Bowen goes to stay with Strether and gets to like the man, but nothing can make Bowen like his writing. After reading a passage of the novel under suspicion, One Word More, written with all the stately elaborations of Henry James, Bowen wants to put the man who had written that in the stocks and stand in front of him with a peck, or better a bushel, of ripe tomatoes, and throw one at him for each time he failed to justify any phrase, on grounds of clarity, common sense, emotional decency, and general morality. Strether passes the test of being Strether, but as a writer he fails dismally, though partially excused on the grounds of his vintage, and because Bowen has grown rather to like him. In applying his sham-detecting faculties to Strether and his writing, Bowen incidentally sets out something of Amos's own literary position as a writer of the post-Great Writer period, one who sees himself firmly attached to the Greene, War, Isherwood, Powell line of descent. The Strether story is complete invention. There was no mystery for Amos to unravel while he was in Portugal, unlike the rest of the story, which follows in Amos's own footsteps more closely than does the plot of any other of his early novels. But Bowen's sham-detecting faculties are not reserved for literary matters alone. Like some ceaselessly watching radar system, Bowen is forever on the lookout for the bogus, including the bogus in his own reactions. While being driven to meet Strether, he inspects the passing peasantry as closely as he could for signs of instinctive wisdom and the rest of it, but all he could make out for certain was that they looked foreign, dowdy, and on the whole rather amiable. Some of them had even waved as they passed. The natives are largely exonerated. It is the false expectations generated by travel writers that are to blame for the travellers' overheated imaginings about them. The attitudes Bowen displayed were to add a new note to Amos's growing reputation. Now he was not only a provincial Philistine drunk, boor, lefty, and all-purpose angry young man, he was an abroad hater too. There was some truth in this. Amos did and does prefer his home turf to any imaginable green pasture across the sea. This is a matter partly of personal taste, partly of Amos's anxious dislike of the hazardous business of travel and dealing with day-to-day matters under foreign rules and in foreign languages. It is not a question of disliking foreign countries or people. I shouldn't like you to get the idea I'm trying to knock Portugal or the Portuguese, Bowen says to Hyman when he is back in London. It's a very nice-looking place, all round, and if you exclude the government and the upper classes, the people are as decent as you'd find anywhere. These are Amos's sentiments exactly, as are the feelings Bowen goes on to express. It's just that the place is located abroad, and the people are foreigners, which merely means that they and I belong to different nations, so we can't understand each other or get to know each other as well as chaps from the same nations can. For Amos, as for Bowen, the essence of what is wrong with being abroad is that it cuts you off from your familiar habitat, the place where you can most naturally flourish. At least, when the army took you abroad, it imposed a purpose outside yourself and provided you with a job, a circle of friends, recognized modes of leisure, and a coherent attitude to your surroundings. For a civilian abroad, however, there is simply nothing to do. Away from what he knows, confused and bedazzled by unfamiliar surroundings, with no reason to be where he is more compelling than whim, the traveller misreads the behaviour of the locals and confers wholly unwarranted significance on things that happen to him, which might just as easily have happened at home, where, if they did, they would pass unregarded. The literary traveller is no less susceptible, in fact more so, because all too likely to disguise his ignorance about what is going on by calling it mystically fine, and to further disguise his crappy opinions in overwrought prose. In all this, Amos and Bowen are at one. Amos may have found it impossible to insert himself as a real-life character in his Portugal book, but he and his opinions are very much present in it all the same. So much so that at least one way of looking at the novel is to see it as a convenient structure like a washing line, on which to hang out his views about literature and abroad. Amos never did quite find his own way through the problems of travel writing. At ease in most literary genres, from the novel to the restaurant review, writing about abroad is something he has mostly avoided. He salvaged only one piece of journalism from his Somerset Maugham excursion, published in the Spectator's 1956 travel supplement under the title Lusitanian Liquors. Among Portugal's many attractions for the tourist, it begins, Portuguese drinking is paramount. Here he was on safe ground. By sticking to the subject of booze, which he knew a good deal about, and which, like music, speaks in an international language with local variations, he avoided the many snares that litter the path of the susceptible literary tourist. But thereafter he left travel writing largely alone. 12. Princeton. Amos's second lengthy excursion abroad in the 1950s was a very different matter from Portugal. This time he went to America, as visiting fellow in creative writing at Princeton for the 1958-9 academic year. Here there was no risk of finding things mystically fine, or of being tempted to empurple his prose to describe what he saw. At Princeton he had a job with which to fill up his time, as he did not in Portugal. Enforced idleness was always to be one of his principal objections to going abroad for no other purpose than to holiday. Better still, the American natives spoke English and were exceedingly hospitable. Amos's was the first generation of Britons to be brought up on a diet of Hollywood movies. He had acquired his own special liking for American science fiction and jazz, so going to America was not really like going to foreign parts at all, more like moving in for a spell with distant but congenial relatives. There were, of course, the usual horrible preliminaries to be got through. Most of my creative energy for the last 10 days has been siphoned off into the completion of the 14 forms or copies of forms I must fill up, Amos complained to Larkin in May 1958. You know the kind of thing. Mr., Mrs., or Miss, then sex. How many female Misters and male Misses do they get? Good mind to put yes for sex. The mere thought of going to America aroused apprehensions in Amos. He felt panicky about the trip. He told Larkin in August, perhaps Americans wouldn't like him for being British. He was afraid of not being able to teach creative writing properly, or indeed at all. Amos was not afraid of liking America so much that he might want to stay, but rather feared hating it so much he would want to come home by about bonfire night, 5th of November. He was worried about running out of money, too. Within hours of arrival in the Queen Elizabeth, however, all these fears were banished. After putting up with the sloth of New York dockers unloading his ship, and being driven to Princeton along the New Jersey Turnpike with its wondrous multicolored lights, he lost any reservations he might have had, including those created by his lingering leftist doubts about American capitalism and power, and he made up his mind that this was his second country, and always would be. At first, 4 Amoses moved into 271 Edgestown Road. Kingsley, his father William, and sons Philip and Martin, now aged 10 and 9 respectively, to be joined a week later by Hilly and 4-year-old Sally, who had to stay behind so that Sally could have an operation to remove a growth on her leg, which happily turned out to be benign. After only 1 day, Amos told the Princeton packet that he thought Princeton was a lovely community. It reminded him of Sussex. The houses were, as he had expected, white and boxy, with neat, green shutters. Having stopped off for a sandwich on the road from New York, he was ready to denounce its British counterpart, in American style, as just out of it. Their house was rented from Murray Kempton, then as now a well-known New York journalist, who was away for a year in Italy. Amos described it in his memoirs as a residential bit, laid out in the best posh rural American style, with a great deal in the way of lawn, few flowers, no fences, and a patch of woodland at the back, where a deer would sometimes wander, just a few minutes' drive from the center of town. The neighbors were helpful about everything from cars to schools. They invited him in for drinks at all hours, in fact, filling up every vacant slot in the day. Even brunch turned out to be less a merger of convenience between breakfast and lunch, and more an excuse to make an early start on drinking. At the end of October, 6 weeks after his arrival, Amos wrote to Conquest, "All very jolly here. Settling in fine, with the smell of bourbon and king-sized Chesterfields overall. Cirrhosis and lung cancer have moved into an altogether more proximate position relative to me. The neighbours also found Amos a maid called May, a middle-aged black woman who mocked him with her bogus southern accent, and drove him on his first morning to the Firestone Library in a pink Cadillac, but had to be got rid of for, among other things, stealing the family sweaters. Some minor American habits Amos found hard to get used to. Everyone talks a lot, he told Conquest, though nobody ever says fuck or shit, and sex is regarded as a topic like any other, about as basic as horticulture or water skiing. Never any jokes about it, even from New York businessmen, etc. He put the same point in a letter to Violet and Anthony Powell a few days later, though in less blunt terms. Princeton is fine, with crowds of hard-drinking academics who are good in the ways the ones at home are bad, e.g. drinking, amiability, but bad in the ways the others are good. These never swear. I had to wait for the arrival of another Englishman to do this, except to myself or in the family circle, and they like to talk of matters connected with the practice or appreciation of the arts. Amos always preferred a conversation with a lot of no-nonsense swearing in it to one with a lot of nonsense about art. He took a weekly class at the library on the principles of literature, or some similarly ponderous theme, but his main teaching duty was to go through with a couple of dozen students their fledgling attempts to write. He conducted these sessions in room 215E2 of the Firestone Library, tucked in between Philately and the Woodrow Wilson collection. Creative writing is all right, Amos told Conquest, especially with one Ed Hirsch, who turns in a semi-pornographic story every time. Students amiable, of immense physical stature, keen. One would-be poet told him, "Sir, I just don't take too much account of the reader," and added that he didn't think he had anything too important to say. Whatever the reader managed to get out of his poems was, it seemed, all right by him. Amos saw signs in this of the characteristically modern failing of careless obscurity. Since it was tolerated among the greats, it was perhaps only to be expected in beginners too. After all, if they turned out to be any good, someone would write a book explaining what they were talking about, and so save them the trouble of making this clear from the start. Back home, such attitudes would probably have earned the students who expressed them a piece of the Amos mind, vigorously expressed. But in America the students were different. They spoke with a complete lack of arrogance that Amos found wholly disarming, and therefore difficult to denounce. He was genuinely impressed with the talent he saw, or thought he saw. More than 30 years later he could still remember Oshner's accounts of life on the freight riverboats, Houghton on hunting equals shooting, and village feuds in Vermont, Collins on a father's ruthless social pushing of his son, Rose on the crew that dropped the bomb. Amos felt the excitement of somebody accidentally present at the first stirring of an outburst of new talent. Writing in the Observer at the end of 1958, he compared the work he had seen at Princeton with what he had read in British student magazines, and concluded, "I'm sorry to tell you this, gentlemen, but they, and you and I, conceivably, may look a little thin-blooded when the Williamsons and Bernsteins, not their real names, get going." But they never did. Amos heard of one would-be playwright who managed to get a play produced, though not on Broadway, and a couple more students who published a single novel each, but none went on to any sort of literary glory, leading Amos to think he had underrated the extent to which high intelligence and a sense of purpose find a real but incidental and passing literary expression in more than a few young people. Teaching creative writing probably taught Amos more than his students, about America and about literature. One other teaching obligation fell Amos's way. He was due to conduct the Christian Gauss seminars on criticism, taking over in the spring from the American critic Dwight MacDonald, who had been teaching mass culture for the first part of the academic year. R.P. Blackmore, the poet and critic who was responsible for Amos at Princeton, suggested he make science fiction the theme of his 6 lectures. Amos was willing enough, but not well enough briefed. He had been a science fiction fan ever since investigating a bin in his local Woolworths labeled Yank magazines. Interesting reading when he was 12 or thereabouts. But he had never read the genre in any systematic way. Amos therefore sent Conquest, a fellow fan, an urgent message. "If ever Amos did anything to win your support, vouchsafe it now. Honestly, if you can send me any griff, or names of anything that might contain griff, any good stories, especially stuff about SF, let me know, eh? Amos felt himself particularly weak on the early days of Jules Verne, and even weaker about even earlier days, including the Alexandrian interplanetary romance he thought Conquest had told him about. He soon found what he needed without Conquest's help. Else Bragg de Camp's science fiction handbook gave him the necessary historical background, and a trip with a large suitcase to Brentano's bookshop in New York yielded an abundance of book and magazine material. He gave his lectures in front of a notable audience, MacDonald, Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt, and Robert Oppenheimer among them, and afterwards found that he could turn his script into a book without too much rewriting. New Maps of Hell was published in New York in 1960 and in London a year later, to more critical attention than anything he had previously published, most of it favourable. This was gratifying, of course, but years later Amos came to think of his book as part of a regrettable change in the science fiction climate, one that was to bring the genre out of its non-literary, non-academic, popular ghetto into the inhospitable glare of respectability, where it suffered all the ills of modernism and experiment, and went into what might be terminal decline. Science fiction has come from Chaucer to Finnegan's Wake in less than 50 years, Amos wrote in 1981. In other words, from first bloom all the way to disintegration. Jazz, he thought, had gone the same way long before. The rise and fall of genres, even entire art forms, he observed going on all the time. The difference with science fiction was that he feared he might inadvertently have given it a helping heave down the slope to destruction. There was a good train service to New York, and Amos took advantage of it for frequent trips, usually making it back to Princeton to sleep. He found the city impressive as well as entertaining, and wrote in his memoirs that anyone who walks up Fifth Avenue, say, on a sunny morning, without feeling his spirits lift, is an asshole. His first day there, Amos told the Powells, introduced him to the English tourist doing the place in 12 hours, and included a conversation with a publisher, 6'3", son of Middle West miner, Montenegrin ancestry. Lunch with queer Broadway producer, party at magazine office, martinis at 4 p.m., dinner in Greenwich Village, mainly palate-eroding cheese, intellectual party, during which I heard one bearded man ask another if he really understood what intellectual integrity was. Honest now. Jazz session with a lot of conscientious interracial camaraderie, and finally slumber in Auden's bed. All right, WHA is in Rome. The magazine office party was for Esquire's 21st birthday issue, in which Amos, by lucky chance, had a story. It was Moral Fibre. He was taken there by a man he knew who worked for Esquire, Gene Lichtenstein. Amos got drunk and instinctively avoided Norman Mailer. The party led to a useful contract with the magazine to review foreign, i.e. non-American, films in a column with the title The Art of the Cinema. The pay rate of about 2 and 6 a word was then so far beyond London rates it led Amos to tell Conquest that if he stopped writing for The Spectator or The Observer it was not out of laziness or contempt. From the Esquire party he went on to hear his first American jazzman play live. This was the saxophonist Sonny Rollins. Not Amos's kind of player, but he didn't let that stop him enjoying the experience. As it was too late to catch the train back to Princeton, Lichtenstein gave Amos a bed at his apartment in the Bowery, which he had presumably borrowed or rented from W.H. Auden. Plucking down a copy of Crabtree's poems in the flat, Amos told the Powells, I saw on the flyleaf, To Whiston, we must love one another and die, Cyril. Didn't look at any others for fear of anticlimax. This, Amos assumed, was a variation made by Cyril Connolly, the London literary critic of Auden's famous line, We must love one another or die. In November, Amos went on another New York trip, to a debate at the Young Men's Hebrew Association at Hunter College, on the subject, Is There a Beat Generation? Jack Kerouac, famous as the author of On the Road, was also on the platform, as were James Weschler, editor of the New York Post, and Ashley Montague, a British anthropologist at Princeton. According to the version of what went on, given by a reporter from the Village Voice, this was a pretty chaotic event, with Kerouac dashing off stage a dozen times, clowning with a hat to the final stumble, and wild dragging of poet Allen Ginsberg on stage. According to Amos's own account in Harper's Magazine, Kerouac did his best to make them uneasy, by greeting him with "Hello, my dear," and telling Montague that he had seen him on the Jack Parr show, but that Montague had had nothing new to say. Then Kerouac went over to the backstage piano and began playing a version of the dear old Warsaw Concerto, but broke off every now and then to appear before the photographers. Kerouac switched to left-handed boogie-woogie, and when they finally went on stage, he responded to the cheers of the audience, all directed at him, with weaves, bobs, and a chimpanzee shuffle or two. While Weschler was speaking, Kerouac wandered about the stage wearing his hat. The Beats, Kerouac said in the Village Voice account, were a swinging group of new American boys intent on life. Being beat goes back to my ancestors, to the rebellious, the hungry, the weird, and the mad, to Laurel and Hardy, to Popeye, to wimpy-looking, wild-eyed hamburgers, the size of which they make no more. There were two types of beat, he went on. The cool, bearded, sitting without moving in cafes, with their unfriendly girls dressed in black, who say nothing, and the hot, crazy, talkative, mad, shining eyes, running from bar to bar only to be ignored by the cool subterraneans. Amis, described as wearing a conservative light brown suit, was reported to have been perplexed by the mad audience, but in a friendly way trying to understand the madness. He poured a full bucket of cold water on the idea that there was any connection between Britain's angry young men and the Beats. Indeed, on the belief that any such group could be properly said to exist at all. The Angries were an invention of literary middlemen, desperate journalists who thrive on classifications and clichés, who put writers in pigeonholes and save people the trouble of reading. Anyone under pensionable age was liable to be included in this mythical group, Amis said. Any day I expect to see Boris Pasternak, born 1890, so labelled. John Osborne was angry, Amis conceded, but all the English writers put in this category, along with him, were only doing what writers have always done. They're going about the job of writing. There is no angry young men movement. There may be a beat generation, but I doubt it. Weschler was puzzled. After listening to Kerouac, I understand less about what the Beats stand for than before, and unimpressed. There is no valor in their kind of flight and irresponsibility. Montague, described as white-haired, calm, slightly sleepy-looking, was more sympathetic to Kerouac, if solemnly condescending, too. The Beats give personal testimony to the breakdown of Western values. These are the children who were failed by their parents. The Beat writers are describing this generation. Afterwards, Amis told the Village Voice reporter, "There I was, sitting back, waiting for Mr. Kerouac to be funny, but somehow he never quite got there, though he did a lot of shaping up to be funny, 50 minutes of it, in fact, compared with the 10 minutes each that were allowed to the other three." In his memoirs, Amis wrote that his side had won the argument, but lost the performance. The Beats came very firmly into Amis's no good at all category of writer, but he thought they had a malign influence all the same, especially on poetry, helping to reduce parts of it to spoken script or rock without the music. He was dismayed when he spoke about them to Norman Mailer, whose 1949 novel The Naked and the Dead Amis valued highly, only to find himself getting a proclamation of their merits and significance, which, on reflection, Amis found boded worse for Mailer than it did for Kerouac. Thinking over this literary skirmish in Harper's, Amis wondered why it was that people went to discussions or lectures by literary persons at all. For most of those present, he thought, the speakers might as well be talking Choctaw. The visual appeal is what counts. Mr. Kerouac was shrewd enough to have grasped that. Puzzled though Amis was by whatever system of inducement or threat persuaded people to turn out for lectures, they did so in sufficient numbers to tickle even a writer's vanity, while greed was abundantly satisfied. Since his earnings from Princeton were not going as far as expected, he willingly made himself available for lectures, usually for about $300 per performance, in any part of America reachable by a car or train of reasonable length. This took him, among other places, to Philadelphia, to Yale in New Haven, to Vassar at Poughkeepsie, New York State, and via Chicago to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. On the whole, he was well entertained and received on these trips. At Yale, he was handed a dry martini by his host, Archibald S. Ford, before he had time to remove his overcoat, a record of instant hospitality to remain forever unbeaten. His audiences were at least polite and attentive. The only man who made faces at him was, as Amis later discovered, an official of Her Majesty's government, which I was mildly denouncing at the time. But even the officials' faces were mild ones. Amos only put a foot seriously wrong once, he believed, in Philadelphia, where he decided to abandon straightforward jokes in favor of a long, humorless, pseudo-academic diatribe on the comic spirit recited absolutely deadpan by a supposed comic writer. He did not recall this incident too accurately later, being too busy keeping his own composure in the manner of someone who has had too much to drink, but his impression was that it went down badly, except for a reference to vomiting, which laid a single undergraduate in the aisle. Retribution for this lapse of humorless standards was swift. During the ensuing party, Amos's script was stolen. This was something of a setback, since he had been intending to recycle it for later use on some other campus. In Harper's, Amos reflected that he should have interpreted the theft as a blow against authority, to be welcomed as such, and also as a joke, a good deal more pointed and economical than my own. He did not think this at the time, of course, but he did manage to recycle the incident in a different way. It became part of the plot of his American novel One Fat Englishman, published in 1963, with the difference that its hero Roger Mickeldine has his script stolen before he is due to give a lecture, thus giving him an excuse to display all his talents for bad manners, arrogance, and anger by refusing to talk at all.